You are probably clicking this video because you are getting clapped up by Steve players, which is very understandable because there are certain things that you need to understand about Steve or else you'll be having your cheeks clapped endlessly. One of these things is Lionheart stance. In season 2, this stance got buffed and is one of the reasons Steve is currently a top 10 character. No, he is not top 5. You legit just don't know what you're doing. But I'm here to help you today, so let's get into this. So, Lionheart is a mix-up stance. The aim of this stance is to force you to guess. Steve does this in a more unconventional kind of way, which is different from the regular low-mid mix-up, and instead has a high guard break that he mixes up with mid options. Lionheart stance is pretty easy to kind of analyze because it only has 3 moves, so it's purely a mix-up stance, so it's nothing goofy like Zafina's stances or Yoshimitsu's, whatever. Lionheart 1 is a 14 frame homing mid that heat engages and wall splats, so very threatening. Lionheart 2 is a 16 frame unsafe mid tailspin, which is okay I guess. And Lionheart 1+2 is a high guard break that gives a guaranteed 12 frame move and also armor breaks, wall splats and launches on normal hit. A lot of things I know. Lionheart 1 is completely safe. It's -9 on block, so this is probably going to end up being the most used option from Steve when he enters this stance. Which means stepping this stance is a no-go. Technically you can step both Lionheart 1+2 and Lionheart 2, however this move basically keeps you locked down because landing one of these is a heat engager, which is a full bar of heat and is always horrible for you. So I would advise to never step this stance. This move can be made even more safe by transitioning into flicker, which will make the Steve -3. In my opinion, this is the most broken thing about this stance because at -3 flicker, Steve has a number of options he can go for to continue his pressure. So while not incredibly consistent, sometimes Steve can continue his offense even after having a mix-up blocked, which is OD in my opinion. So you have to be ready for this. Steve's fastest move in flicker is 12 frames, so at -3, you can click anything up to 14 frames without trading I believe. So the Steve has to use very specific options to counteract this -3. Firstly, Steve can side sway, which is pretty risky for him because if you just click a move with tracking, you're going to clip him. Side sway is pretty much only effective if you decide to click a linear 10 frame or something, which I don't recommend doing. What I would generally do in this situation is hit him with a fast mid that tracks. So basically everyone's down forward 1 should get the job done here. If you're a Kazuya or something, you probably would have the down forward 2 counter hit here, but for Kazuya it's more of a mind game because Steve might just not click. Of course, some characters don't have good tracking on their down forward ones as well, so you might have to find an alternative. However, if you still don't have any of these things, sway is a pretty committal thing anyways. All of the moves can either be ducked or are unsafe or lose their turn, whatever. Swaying is literally only good if the Steve is evading something or you just don't click. And Steve also has a move from flicker to stop you from clicking. Flicker back 2 is a high 14 frame power crush which will beat you trying to mash into sway and is safe on block, it's -9. Something else he can do here if you stand block is flicker jab into albatross mix. Oh, and he can also duck in and back sway, but hitting a quick mid also beats these options. If you are a character with a high power crush, that will beat just about everything Steve can do here, whilst remaining safe. So if you play like Asuka or something, this interaction is a lot simpler for you guys. You literally just decide block or power crush. But for everyone else, this interaction is all about mind games. This may seem pretty oppressive from the Steve, but Steve is working a lot harder here to really get damage onto you if you're just stand blocking. And all of the times where he's just deciding to play safe, that's you collecting info, you know, or at least you should be. So it's really just a matter of deciding whether you think the Steve is going to click or not. If you think Steve is going to power crush, just block. If you think Steve is going to sway, then click your tracking mid. Of course, you can just play safe and just not click, and either take an albatross mix or a sway move that likely ends the Steve's turn or is duckable. Like legit stand blocking this pressure is very effective in the long run. This somehow turned into a flicker video, but yeah, Lionheart 1 is pretty busted. Lionheart 1 plus 2 is what you will be mixing with Lionheart 1, and this is a guard break that gives a guaranteed 2-2, which is 17 damage into plus 6. Now, despite all the properties that make this move sound good, Lionheart 1 is significantly better than this move. 17 damage is less damage than a 10 frame punish by like 5 points, so you can hold a lot of these, especially with the health buffs in Season 2. If you haven't already gathered, you do not mash into Lionheart. There is too much to deter you from doing so between a homing Lionheart 1 and an armor break Lionheart 1 plus 2. The way you deal with this mix is to hold these 1 plus 2s. Which feels very scrubby, and it is, because this is technically just free offense for Steve basically, but you have to weigh up the risk reward. Steve is risking his life every single time he goes for this 17 damage move, because you can duck and launch Lionheart 1 plus 2. Whilst you're holding these guard breaks, you're not getting hit by Lionheart 1, which is a heat engager and wall splat, and you're collecting info on how your opponent uses 1 plus 2, so you get a better idea of when to duck. Neither Lionheart 1 or Lionheart 1 plus 2 do significant damage. So if Steve is spamming this stance, you shouldn't be losing. I'ma be real. You could guess right accidentally and get all the damage he did to you back in one combo. Stand blocking is legit the best defense into this stance. Lionheart is not a threatening 50-50. Of course, going match by match, Steve players have different tendencies, but I do like to give you guys a general gauge of how much you should be ducking, blocking, whatever when dealing with 50-50 situations. So you can kind of understand the risk reward of your decisions. Because, like for example, if a character has a launching hell sweep and he's mixing that up with a mid that does poke damage, you're going to block the low way more than you are the mid, because it does more damage and puts you in a far worse situation. In Steve's case, people tend to try and duck Lionheart 1 plus 2 way more than they ever should. And that is speedrunning death against a Steve player, because as soon as he thinks you're ducking too much, he's just going to say, fuck Lionheart 1 and just outright launch you with the riskier Lionheart 2, you know. When it comes to Lionheart, I would say 80% of the time, I would just hold the guard break. This sounds like Steve propaganda, but literally ask any Steve main that doesn't eat glue. An opponent who is just standing there and holding the guard breaks is far more annoying than someone who ducks you constantly, because Lionheart 1 plus 2 is the only real guaranteed way to open your opponent up in this mix, and it gets riskier and riskier the more that you use it. The other 20% of the time would obviously be ducking, because you don't ever mash into Lionheart and you don't ever step this stance. So yeah, literally going into flicker at -3 is more threatening than this Lionheart 50-50. I'ma be real. And if you guys don't believe me, which a lot of people just don't when I talk about this particular situation, between Steve mains, what I'm telling you is really obvious common knowledge. But to a lot of people, they just see free 17 damage and be like, nah, that's not counterplay. And then they just say Steve's OP and just keep ducking the 1 plus 2 and just keep getting clapped. And to be fair, they're half right. Technically, this 50-50 has no counterplay. But the play is 17 damage. This mix is more brain dead than it is actually good. It's like Olus's chainsaws, there's technically no counterplay to chainsaws, technically. But in the end of the day, you kind of just hold that stance offense until you guess on something risky and just blow her up for it, you know. By the way, chainsaws, significantly better than Lionheart, by the way. Now, I've been talking about this stance under the assumption Steve is at +5, which is the frames needed for LH1 to be uninterruptible. Anything below this, you can mash into all of Steve's options because he can only sway and duck in out of Lionheart. Now, the thing with Lionheart is that the ways to access Lionheart are actually far more broken than the actual stance itself. For example, up back 2. This is one of the most broken moves in the game. 17 frame homing high with ridiculous range for what this does and goes into Lionheart at +5 on block. On hit, this also gives a guaranteed Lionheart 1, which is a heat engager. Very broken stuff. Even more broken considering it's a mix with quarter circle forward 1, which is a 16 frame mid heat engager. The usual answer to these mid-speed moves is to just mash into Steve. However, Steve has back one, so good luck with that. The only real counterplay to this is if you have a character that can play at like range 2 to 3 with long range moves that track well. Stuff like Brian, Jin, and just try and whiff punish the Steve a lot. Because in all seriousness, most Steves aren't good. Especially the ones that picked him up in season 2. They only know these two moves, bro. Ducking forward 2 is also another +5 on block transition. This move has just dumbed the fuck down out of ducking, because if you don't want to hold stance pressure, then you're either holding a knockdown low into follow up and pressure, or you're just outright getting launched. It's all very cringe. This is pretty much Steve's design now. It's either high into stance or hold these mids. Like, I still don't think that Steve's mids are particularly good. It's just that his highs are so AIDS right now, it indirectly makes his mids just way more effective than they really should be, to be honest. But that's Lionheart, guys. If you guys enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and until next time, guys.